In the previous video, Channeling Music Part 1, we saw how musicians from Beethoven and Brahms to the Beatles and the Beach Boys had all expressed a view that their music came from beyond the intellect and the brain. Indeed, some famous musicians, such as Haydn and Puccini, believed the source of the music to be God rather than the brain, and even made statements to that effect. We ended Part 1 by asking, if the source of the music isn't the brain, then what is it? Now, there is in fact a 20th century composer who was very specific about where her music came from. Her name was Rosemary Brown, a woman who'd had no musical training apart from a few piano lessons as a child and claimed to have a very limited musical ability. And yet, in the early 1960s, she suddenly became such a prolific composer that in just 6 years she'd written over 400 pieces and had become well known throughout the world. But it wasn't just the music that made her famous. You see, what was particularly unusual about Rosemary Brown was her astonishing explanation of how she had suddenly become such a productive and accomplished composer. The reason she had been able to do this, she said, was because the music that she composed was being directly dictated to her by famous composers of the past. This was a sensational claim and soon caught the attention of the world's media. Journalists and radio crews flocked to hear how she could communicate with composers from beyond the grave, and her story made headline news in many leading newspapers and magazines. Rosemary spoke freely about how she'd always had an ability to see spirits of people who had passed, and how one day Franz Liszt appeared and started dictating music to her, which she diligently wrote down and attempted to play at the piano. This became a regular occurrence, and after several visits, Liszt explained that there were other composers who wished to work with her to pass on their music to the earth in order to demonstrate the continuity of consciousness after death. One by one, he introduced other composers including Chopin, Beethoven, Schubert, Rachmaninoff, and many more, all of whom in turn dictated new pieces of music to her. Newspapers and magazines lapped up her anecdotes. For example, how Schubert, who was short-sighted in his life on Earth, didn't need to wear glasses anymore, or how Liszt would sometimes accompany her to the shops, helping her to avoid overspending on her tight budget by keeping a tally of the cost of her shopping. Eventually, TV companies in both the UK and the United States started to take an interest in her story, inviting her to appear on TV shows and even producing documentaries about her. Here's a short clip from one such programme produced in the early 1970s, in which Rosemary is suddenly and unexpectedly contacted by Beethoven.
We had not yet finished setting up our equipment when Rosemary Brown suddenly rose from where she was sitting, walked over to the piano, and started writing down notes. After a while, she laid her pencil aside, turned to us, and declared that Beethoven had just told her to pause so that we could finish our preparations. We were all somewhat perplexed at this unexpected, helpful intervention, but Rosemary Brown seemed to think it quite natural that Beethoven should give directions from the beyond. The new piece of music was completed in approximately 1 hour.
Beethoven telling me to try to hurry up. I got really fast. I've come to an easy part. It's the same 2 bars again with the right hand an octave higher, so I can just copy the previous 2 bars instead of trying to listen to what he's saying. It's so easy to make a mistake. I thought he said E and he said C. No, it sounds so much like C. We've got quite a lot of music here now. I think there are some bars missing. When I took a break and then came back again, it seems to me that something was left out. In fact, Beethoven has told me that when I get to the end of this part, there should be 32 bars, and there are only 28, so obviously there are 4 bars gone adrift somewhere. But what we have so far, I would like to play through Of course, I'm not a concert pianist, and I may have to play a little slowly. I may hesitate a little as I read it through, but it would be nice to hear what it sounds like.
Not surprisingly, Rosemary Brown's story generated a lot of interest and divided opinion amongst the general public, with many believing that she was truly receiving music from the composers of the past, whilst others dismissed her either as a fraud or just a deluded middle-aged woman. So was she genuine, or was she a fake? Many leading experts of the day offered their views about Rosemary's story. On the one hand, there were those who believed the so-called composers to be secondary personalities of a delusional woman, or that her music was the work of her own subconscious mind. Others dismissed her as a musically talented charlatan who was conning the public about her lack of training. A number of figures were, however, astonished that she had been able to compose so many pieces, true to the style of different composers, and as amazing as her story appeared to be, they were willing to accept that these composers had indeed dictated this music to her. On the surface, it seems that the debate is pretty evenly balanced, but when we look at the credentials of the public figures on each side of this debate, we see a clear picture emerging. In fact, let me summarise it in order to make it clearer still. Now, if I wanted an opinion on whether an untrained musician such as Rosemary Brown could have written over 400 pieces of music over a 6-year period, each convincingly faking the styles of different composers, then personally I'd value the view of a musician above that of a psychologist every day of the week. It's also worth noting that the one psychologist who was prepared to accept Rosemary Brown's claims was the only one who had conducted a first-hand study of her. And there's one more compelling piece of support for her story that is, for me at least, the most convincing of all, but more of that later. Now, if these famous composers did indeed pass on their music to Rosemary Brown, is it possible that other musicians living and working today are also being helped by composers or performers from the past, with or without their knowledge? To answer that question, we can turn to the work of another medium, Leslie Flint, who, like Rosemary Brown, was working in the mid-20th century. He had a very unusual gift in that he could manifest an energetic voice box in mid-air through which spirits were able to speak out loud. During the 1950s and 60s, he was regularly contacted by Frédéric Chopin, and thankfully some of these sessions were tape-recorded. So here is one such recording in which Chopin talks about his efforts to help musicians living today.
I go to many people, although you are the only person who realizes that I come. The others are blind and they are deaf to my presence, but I try to help them with their music. And there are a few young musicians that I have a very great interest in, that I'm helping to train from this side. You know, it is rather disappointing that they are not conscious of my presence, but nevertheless I try to help them as best I can.
On another occasion, he describes helping a pianist with his performance.
It was very interesting to me. That man, it was like as if he was wax in my hand. It was amazing because he is very suitable subject. Towards the end of the performance especially, I seemed to get complete control, You know, he was so tired, he did not know what he was doing hardly. But he was like a man in the trance.
Now, if this really was the voice of Chopin speaking to us from other realms, then what he is describing fits extremely well with the observations of musicians today, such as Brian Wilson, who was aware of the presence of a higher force when he was writing his songs, or Bruce Springsteen, who claimed he didn't know where some of his songs had come from. We saw in part 1 of this series of videos how Dave Gilmour had moments which made him wonder where the music he was playing was coming from, which is similar to the experience of another guitarist, John McLaughlin of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, who once described how one night we were playing and suddenly the spirit entered into me, and I was playing, but it was no longer me playing. These experiences are a direct mirror to Chopin's description of how he took control at the hands of a performer playing the piano. So thanks to Chopin, we might have an answer to the question, where does music come from? But is this really Chopin's voice that we hear magically speaking to us from beyond the grave? Surely a more likely explanation for many is that Leslie Flint was simply a clever fraudster who was making his living by conning those gullible enough to believe he had an amazing psychic gift. Well, there is of course one person who claimed to know exactly what Chopin's voice was like, and that's Rosemary Brown. Back in the 1960s, she also heard some of these recordings, and she confirmed that the voice, the accent, and the vocal inflections sounded exactly the same as when she heard Chopin's voice directly. Now that's fine if we believe Rosemary Brown, but as we've seen, there were many who didn't, and anyone claiming that her story was a scam can also point to a likely motive. After all, the publicity her story received transformed her from an impoverished widow, struggling to provide for her family, into a well-known celebrity who mixed with the rich and famous of the day. So was her story a fake, or was it true as many believed, and if so, is there any evidence that she was a woman of integrity? Now for me at least, that evidence comes from her mystery supporter. That person is John Lill, one of the leading pianists of his generation, whose career now spans 6 decades. Back in 1973, he attended a recital given by Rosemary Brown, who performed her music before inviting questions from the audience. At this point, John Lill rose from his seat, introduced himself to Rosemary and the audience, and asked if he could say a few words. He stated that he was absolutely convinced that her work was authentic, and that his conviction had been upheld by none other than Beethoven. He went on to explain that he had a very close rapport with the spirit of Beethoven and was himself able to communicate with him. So here's someone else who claimed to be in communication with a famous composer from the past. However, in this instance, there was nothing at all to be gained from making this claim. In fact, quite the opposite, because he was already world famous after winning the 1970 International Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow. And by bravely making such a sensational statement, he put his reputation and his career at risk. He certainly had to endure mocking comments from time to time. In the decades since, he has shown himself to be a man of immense dignity and integrity, who is willing to restate his spiritual beliefs and his connection to Beethoven whenever he's interviewed. So if John Lill has endorsed Rosemary Brown's claims, then that's good enough for me. And since she confirmed that it was indeed Chopin's voice in these Leslie Flint recordings, then I'm happy to accept that it was Chopin speaking from beyond the grave. So let's remind ourselves of one of the key points that he made in these recordings.
And there are a few young musicians that I have a very great interest in, that I'm helping to train from this side. You know, it is rather disappointing that they are not conscious of my presence, but nevertheless I try to help them as best I can.
So, if Chopin, and presumably other musicians from the past, are willing to help musicians on Earth today, whether or not we are aware of them, then you might wonder how to go about receiving this help. And that's a subject we'll be covering in the next video of this series, Channeling Music Part 3.